Very good afternoon, and thanks for clicking on to the Saturday Tropical Outlook. It is the 27th of July. Before we continue with the video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already done so. I do greatly appreciate that. Coming up tomorrow, we will have the live stream as always at 4 p.m. So I hope you can join me for that. There will be a link in the description below today's video for that. We currently have no current active storms anywhere on the planet at the moment here, and that is quite a big deal considering that we are now towards the end of July here, and we are quickly approaching the busier time of the tropical Atlantic season. We are likely to see things liven up as an active phase of the MJO rotates towards the Americas and the Western Atlantic Basin into the early portions of August. We should start to see things taking place, and some of these tropical waves are becoming a little bit more potent again, coming off the African coastline here. But no current systems to speak about, and according to the National Hurricane Center, we do have a small probability. There's a feature here over the central main development region that is going to track in a west to northwesterly fashion over the next week or so here. So the NHC gives a 30% chance of development within the next 7 days. They go on to say that as of 8 a.m. this morning, near the Lesser and Greater Antilles, an area of disturbed weather over the central tropical Atlantic Ocean is expected to interact with an approaching tropical wave during the next several days. Development of this system is possible while it approaches the Lesser Antilles during the early to middle part of next week, and moves generally west-northwest or near to the Greater Antilles towards the latter part of next week. So we will need to keep our eyes on this going forward. But there is plenty of Saharan dust continuing to track off the Sahara and cross over the Atlantic here, generally just slightly to the north of the MDR. And what that is doing is it's stifling moisture levels within the atmosphere and generally suppressing overall activity. We've also had widespread subsidence over the North Atlantic as well. You can see here, this diagram nicely shows that here. This is the CHI 200 HPA for the next 40 days. This is the forecast of NOAA. And this is essentially the rising versus sinking within the atmosphere. And of late, since Beryl, back at the end of June, beginning of July, we have seen these orangey yellow colours over the Atlantic basin, which has been suppressing the activity within the basin, coinciding quite nicely with the Saharan dust. But if you notice here that the Indian monsoon, the Southeast Asian monsoon, has been very, very active in recent times, then we've seen that pulse moving into the Western Pacific, allowing the development of two systems. We had Praparon, and then we had Gami, which moved into Taiwan. It dumped 66 inches of rain within a 48-hour period. Nothing particularly unusual for Taiwan, may I add. This area is very, very susceptible to extreme rainfall and frequent hits from typhoons. So Gami then moved across Taiwan and moved into China. It's bringing widespread heavy rainfall across eastern areas of China, anywhere from Shanghai, Shandong, Hong Kong, all the way up to Beijing. And that system is going to ride the westerlies into the North Pacific. So we'll keep our eyes on that going forward. But that pulse is continuing to present active, we've not got a system at the moment, but it's continuing to provide some fairly active weather. Heavy rainfall, for example, is quite widespread. It's now over Japan as well, where it's been extremely hot in recent times here. We've seen extreme rainfall, record-breaking rainfall in parts of northern Honshu, for example, and that is because the MJO is in the West Pacific Basin. Now, as we go through the next 40 days, so generally to get a rough idea where we're looking at here, this is the Indian Ocean here, the Western, Central, Eastern Pacific, there's South America, and there's the Atlantic. As we play in towards the latter half of this month, you notice here that we start to see sinking over Indian Ocean, the maritime continent, and into the western portion of the Pacific. That pulse that's currently over this region is going to propagate eastwards over the next couple of weeks, and eventually It will remove the subsidence and provide upward motion within the atmosphere over South America, Central America, the Caribbean, generally the western side of the Atlantic Basin. But this would be in time frame of approximately, you're talking generally mid-August would be the time that you start to see a reversal in the upper air pattern. And that is what we need to watch out. And the models are already starting to show systems developing, moving into the Caribbean. We've obviously got the National Hurricane Center with a 30% chance of this feature developing over the Central Atlantic Basin. So we're already starting to see the slight changes taking place. Now, obviously, we have over 90% of the season yet to go. So we're really not even begun yet. Despite having a Category 5 Hurricane Beryl back at the end of June, beginning of July, we are still to start to really see the meat of the season. Now, if you notice here, this graphic shows the Eastern Pacific Basin hurricane and tropical storm activity between 1971 and 2020. So the average times the Eastern Pacific tends to have warmer, deeper waters than the Atlantic Basin. So therefore, the season tends to become more active early on before the Atlantic does. So you can see here by the time, that's why the season actually begins at the 1st of May as opposed to the 1st of June like we have in the Atlantic Basin. But generally speaking, you can see a fairly sharp uptick in activity over the Eastern Pacific Basin here as we move through the first couple of weeks of May into June, into July. We really start to see things ramping up quite significantly. Meanwhile, over in the Atlantic Basin, we're yet to get there. But with the development of a La Nina, the increase in easterly trade winds over the equatorial Pacific, we should start to see the increase in that cold water over the next month or two in the eastern equatorial Pacific. Now, we know that there's a lag response between the ocean and the atmosphere. However, we are likely to see, as the waters cool, the atmosphere respond. And generally speaking, a La Nina tends to decrease levels of westerly wind shear within the Atlantic Basin. That is the reason why we see more activity during a La Nina as opposed to an El Nino. El Ninos tend to bring stronger westerly winds through the Caribbean, through the main development region of the Atlantic Basin. The opposite takes place with La Nina, and climatology very strongly suggests and shows that the evidence is there. But it's really not until we actually enter the month of August that we start to see things ramping up here, and you can see quite a sharp increase in activity during the mid to second half of August, and the peak of the season actually is mid-September. Then we continue to see a very active period based on climatology through into early October, and then we start to see a drop-off taking place through October and into November. The season ends at the end of November here. Also thought this was quite an interesting graphic to show you here. This actually shows, by the way, based on what I was talking about with regards to the Pacific, it has been, despite the fact that you would normally see a fairly active East Pacific before the Atlantic, this is an interesting one here. This is a tweet here by our good friend Phil Klotzbach, based at CSU. He said that the tropical storm Bud developed over the past week, but has dissipated in the eastern North Pacific to 140 degrees west. It has generated the least accumulated cyclone energy, or ACE. That is essentially the collection of energy released by these systems, known as ACE, in the satellite era since 1966. So we've seen least amount of ACE points within the East Pacific Basin since 1966 of any Eastern North Pacific hurricane season through the 26th of July. So up until now anyway, we've seen the least ACE index since 1966. So this is quite an interesting one, because quite often when the Pacific, both in the west and the east, tends to be quieter, you often find that the Atlantic is busier. And the concern is that as we start to see the increase in the La Nina development over the next 4 or 5 weeks, obviously we'll have reduced wind shear over the Atlantic Basin, but we've also got near record breaking warm sea surface temperatures within the tropics. That coinciding with the cool waters in the East Pacific, You've got ample fuel there. Then, coupled on top of that, we have this MJO pulse expected to move into the Atlantic Basin as we progress through the month of July. All ingredients are then starting to come together for what is likely to be a sharp pickup in activity as we go through the next several weeks here. So these are actually this is a loop over the last, I believe, 60 days or 90 days. It's either 60 or 90. I do apologize for not knowing that. But you can see here the general warm Atlantic Basin here. So we continue to see near or record-breaking warm sea surface temperatures, generally temperatures that you would associate with late August into early September, is present within the tropical Atlantic. We've got the kind of steady progress, especially in recent times, of the La Nina. So the atmosphere and the ocean is becoming better primed for development going forward here. And that MJO pulse rotating into the Atlantic Basin needs to be monitored very, very carefully indeed. This is an interesting satellite image here posted on Twitter by Colin Gross, showing that we've got the waves coming off Africa. We're starting to see the increase in activity over the equatorial western portions of Africa. The West African monsoon, for example, is becoming a little bit stronger and therefore developing bigger waves. And then as they ride the easterly African jet, we're seeing that these waves moving out over the warm waters of the North Atlantic. And it looks as if they're going to start to hold together more. As you start to kind of relax that subsidence and start to see the atmosphere become a little bit more rising and the rise in motion, you're going to start to see these waves holding together as they cross out into the Atlantic Basin and then start to develop. You can see here very, very dusty skies to the north of the ITCZ here. We've got a lot of thunderstorm activity over northern South America as expected, over Central America as well. We're starting to see moisture levels build over this region as the atmosphere starts to change. Look at the dusty air that we're seeing over the Western Caribbean Sea. We're seeing dusty skies, dirty rain, for example, in parts of Cuba. Into Florida, we're seeing thunderstorms developing as you naturally would expect during the daytime heat and as the winds converge. But also we're seeing a blow up of thunderstorms over northeastern Mexico into Texas, etc., etc. We've got a frontal system here over the southern United States as well. And this dust could become quite entrained within this area of active convection over the northern Gulf and the southern United States. We may see rain falling with that dust getting drawn down to the surface. So your car, for example, may become rather dusty over the course of this weekend here. But you can see here, like I say, the La Nina is starting to become a little bit more notable in terms of we're starting to see that kind of stagnation of the temperature. Normally it went below and then it went back above average. Now we're starting to see it going below average once again. We're likely to see a little bit of a burst of stronger easterly trade winds. That should start to allow those waters within the Pacific Basin cooling down. So let's get to some of the charts here. Let me show you. Just bear with me a little second here. So this is the current GOES 16 channel 13 IR temperature brightness here, showing that we've got those active thunderstorms blowing off Africa. You notice here there's a little bit of a kind of southward jog right at the very end of the loop. You notice here that the convection kind of gets blown to the south here. That would suggest to me that we're seeing some stronger winds coming in from a north or northeasterly direction here, just kind of shaving off the tops of these thunderstorms as they blow up over the eastern portion of the tropical Atlantic here. We've got more convection, quite widespread over southern portions of Central America and over some central areas. We've got some thunderstorms just to the east coast of Mexico. There's that frontal system sparking some thunderstorms over the southern portions of Texas, as you can see here, dumping some fairly heavy rainfall. But generally speaking, especially to the north of the main line here of convection, we've got a lot of dry, dusty air to speak about at this moment in time. So anyway, what is the models looking like? Looking purely at the GFS operational, this is over the Atlantic Basin, And you can see here that we do have a feature. This feature right here is the one that the National Hurricane Center are looking towards here for a possible development. Now, as we continue to play through the loop, there's not a great deal to speak about. Quite a strong area of Bermuda high pressure over the western central Atlantic, as you can see. So this is the steering mechanism here. These features here are running the southern flank of this area of high pressure. Notice here that we are seeing some systems developing in the eastern portion of the Pacific Basin. Not one, but a couple of systems are shown to develop as the moisture levels start to increase in the eastern Pacific, as that MJO continues to push eastwards. And then you notice, as we move into the month of August, as the atmosphere starts to change, we're starting to see a feature here just to the south of Cuba developing here. This is one model run. It's not an ensemble, so you just kind of take this with a pinch of salt. But generally, it's what is it telling us? What's the story behind this here? The story is generally that we're going to start to see a better environment increasing with the threat of development. And it might not be until the beginning of week 2 of August, for example. We still might be quite a while away. But you notice here that we've got a feature here at 986 millibars to the south of Mexico in the East Pacific. We've got another system just off the Yucatan here. We've got stronger waves now starting to show up off Africa. And you can see here that we've actually got two features, a 996 millibar area of low pressure, closed circulation, tropical storm, if not weak hurricane. Again, like I say, don't take this as gospel. But what's the model telling us? Strong system over the Eastern Pacific, strong system seen over the Gulf of Mexico here. And it's generally the modeling is indicating that we need to start paying attention to this pattern as we move into the month of August here. And then as we continue to play through the loop here, it's not showing a great deal, but nonetheless, it is beginning. And I think the models will start to pick up on this more and more as we go through the next week or so. I think it's going to start to catch on a lot more. Looking at the GFS ensemble to see what it is indicating here. This is the upper air pattern here. And obviously what we're looking for is the high versus low pressure. You can see here that we've got a split in the ridge here. One piece over the eastern United States, the other over the central and eastern portions of the Atlantic Basin. So another aspect to consider is anything that does develop here may find that weakness in between and go northwards. That may have a significant impact on, for example, the European pattern. So let's have a look at the low-level charts here to see what is shown here. So this is the mean sea level pressure anomaly. Let's go back to the here now. You can see here quite widespread low pressure further north. You want to see high pressure to the north, lower pressure to the south. As we play through this loop here, you can see generally higher pressure seen by the model here. But then as we play through this loop, you start to see that the blues very faint blues start to show up. That is indicating that the pressure is lowering at the surface, while across the mid-Atlantic region here to the north, you're seeing an increase in pressure here. This is generally a more conducive environment when you see higher pressure at the surface to the north, lower pressure within the MDR. That is showing that the atmosphere is becoming a little bit more established and a little bit more noteworthy here. You notice here some blues here indicating lower pressure at the surface underneath that ridge of high pressure. Looking at the overview chart here, let me just see what else I can show you here before we move on. Let's see here. So this is the Vortmax chart here. So this is cyclonic vorticity shown at 700 millibars here. If we go back to the here now, generally you can quite often see these waves actually embedded within the easterly flow. And as we play through the loop here, you can see the high pressure to the north here. And then these kind of yellowy colors are representing essentially the African waves moving across the Atlantic Basin. What you want to start to see is closed contours, little areas of low pressure kind of developing within the flow. Now, generally speaking, the GFS ensemble is not really picking up in anything particular at this very moment in time. But as we play through the course of August, I would expect to start to see the modelling picking up on some of these features here, these larger African waves that are moving into the Atlantic Basin with sea surface temperatures of 27 plus Celsius. Then as we move into the Western Atlantic Basin, the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, we've got near record ocean heat content. That is the water temperature at around 29, 30 Celsius, even 31 Celsius in a few spots. But it's extending down below the surface that is important here, because these systems that cross over these warm waters tend to upwell colder water from deep below. But if you've got warm water deep below the surface, it can't upwell that cold water. So therefore, it's ample high-octane fuel that essentially drives intensification, and sometimes, and quite often seems to be the case recently, is rapid intensification. We've seen that with Beryl, and we are unfortunately likely to see that in the Atlantic Basin going forward here. We've seen it with Gamey as well, going from a Cat 1 to Cat 4 equivalent before hitting Taiwan, for example. And I think the general warmth of the ocean this year constitutes a concern for rapid cyclogenesis going forward. But I wanted to also show you, this was actually the point I was trying to make a little bit earlier here, if I can find the appropriate graphic. Going back to climatology, this is an interesting one here. This is a tropical cyclone points of origin between 1851 and 2015. So that's quite a lengthy period of climatology. Generally, it's very slow to start with. Naturally, you have two features here in this period between the 1st through the 10th of May. This is what I'm showing you here because a lot of people after Beryl thought it's been hyped up this hurricane season. It's not going to happen. This proves that it's a natural downward time. The atmosphere doesn't tend to be as conducive. We've got dust, we've got shear. Also, the sea surface temperatures, albeit we've got conducive sea surface temperatures this year because we're at record-breaking levels, but quite often during the month of May, June, and even into July, you tend to find the water temperatures are just slightly marginally below the threshold of 27 Celsius or above, especially in the central and eastern portion of the Atlantic Basin. This year is different because we're seeing midsummer, late summer sea surface temperatures very early on, and that's what allowed Beryl to develop so quickly and so strongly. But notice here, as we move May 11th through the 20th, we're starting to see more systems develop. And look at the eastern portion of the equatorial Pacific Basin. You tend to find naturally quite a few systems develop. We also have some in the Caribbean and also the western open Atlantic Basin. Then going forward through the month of May, look at the eastern Pacific. Because the water temperatures are naturally warmer here, the atmosphere tends to be a little bit more conducive than the Atlantic. You tend to find quite a strong congregation to the south of Mexico during this latter half of May. Then as we move into the month of June, you can see here that we start to increase the development within the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Caribbean Sea. So this is obviously climatology and points of origin during a lengthy period of climatology. And you can see here a very active period. This just shows you, by the way, how quiet the Pacific Basin has been. We've had two systems develop since the beginning of the East Pacific season back on the 1st of May. So a really remarkable, historic lack of activity in the East Pacific Basin. So you can see here that we start to increase. Notice here that we continue to see systems developing over the western side of the Atlantic Basin. Remember, Beryl was a record breaker for developing as a hurricane to the east of the Lesser Antilles. That was a first in meteorology and climatology, should I say more accurately. June 11th through the 20th, again, busy East Pacific. We've got the congregation of systems in the western Atlantic Basin. But as going through the month of July, you notice we're starting to see more systems developing to the east of the islands here in the main portion of the Atlantic Basin. And then as we move, and this is the key to what I'm trying to say, it's as we step out of July and into August, we start to see the season really getting going. The atmosphere, the ocean becomes coupled, more and conducive, and with a La Nina in particular, we have the prospects of a big season coming up. August 11th through the 20th, this is us approaching the peak of a typical Atlantic hurricane season. You see all the dots now extending all the way back to Cape Verde and the east coast, the west coast of Africa. Sorry. So there you go here. As we move out of August into September, look at that there. And unfortunately, based on everything that we're seeing, this is going to be a big season, folks, with a lot of big storms. Obviously, we don't know exactly where they're going to track. That will depend on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and weaknesses and strength of it, positioning, etc., etc. But this is going to start to ramp up. And a lot of the reason why is because we're going to see less African dust and more in the way of upward motion within the right area, i.e. the Americas and the Western Atlantic Basin. So I think I've covered enough for now. I hope you've enjoyed today's content. If you did, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already done so, hit that subscribe button as well. And join me at 4 p.m. tomorrow for a look at all things global. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Bye for now.